Coming up on the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson, Pope Francis has died. We reflect on his life, his legacy, and what happens now.
Cari fratelli e sorelle, buona Pasqua.
On what is, for Catholics, the holiest day of the year, Easter Sunday, Pope Francis gave the blessing in St. Peter's Square. It would be his last. Having long struggled with his health, he died early on Easter Monday, and millions of Catholics worldwide began to mourn. As pilgrims begin their journey to the Vatican, as the cardinals prepare to assemble to elect the next pope, this time on the Sky News Daily, we wanted to mark the passing of Pope Francis and reflect on a life devoted to the Catholic Church. The Sky's Barbara Serra is about to head to Rome herself to cover the next few weeks. And Barbara, look, I suppose this must be a curious time for you. You're a broadcaster, a journalist, of course, but also Italian and a Catholic.
It is a strange day, and I'll be honest with you, I am more upset, or was more upset when I found out that the Pope had died than I thought I would be. It has to be said, Catholics, lapsed Catholics, other Christian denominations, Muslims. And I think there is a general sense that it came as a real shock, first of all, because, we all saw him yesterday in St. Peter's Square. And that B, also, he was someone that whatever you thought of his policies was obviously authentic, a genuine man who believed in the teachings of the church. So I think, I think I'm surprised and more sad than I thought I would be.
This is, of course, a story you've covered before. You covered the death of Pope John Paul II for Sky News. I imagine, given the circumstances of his death, the passing of the years, this will be a rather different trip.
Completely. And I have to say that it's very strange to be in the UK and hearing news of the Pope dying, because when Pope John Paul II died, all the reporters had been in Rome, for weeks, some months, because it had been a very long, drawn-out illness. Whereas with Pope Francis, we didn't see that. We saw the 5 weeks he spent at the Gemelli Hospital. And then I have to say, and I don't know whether this is the right word to use, it's like his death could not have been almost choreographed in a better way. The last time that the world sees the Pope is in the Vatican, Easter Sunday, when he's driving around in the Pope-mobile, talking to the faithful, meeting the faithful, blessing babies, and then he just dies in his sleep very quickly. So, yeah, it will be a very different trip because he was a very different Pope.
Is there a sense then, in your mind, that Francis held on for that moment to be able to give the Easter blessing?
Listen, he was certainly advised to by doctors that when he left hospital, he should have been on bed rest. He shouldn't have met, children, for example, because he was obviously at risk of infection. I think he did that maybe for about 5 days, and then he was back out there, doing all sorts of things. Just on Thursday, he went to one of the jails in Rome, where he customarily does, the Pope does. Usually he would wash the prisoners' feet, but he didn't do that this time because he wasn't strong enough. But even there, he went and said, why is it you here and not me? We saw him meet the King and Queen. He met J.D. Vance yesterday. So, he'd been told to slow down, but I think he lived the end of his papacy very much like he lived the whole of his papacy. It was a life for service, and he realized the importance for Catholics around the world of seeing, the embodiment of the Pope, because that's what the Pope is. We often say God's representative on earth, and he is the embodiment of the church. And I think he always realized how important it was. I think he was never really going to resign. And some commentators were mentioning, will he step down because it's Jubilee year and he can't dedicate himself like he would have wanted to. But I think he just decided that he would, give his life to what he saw as to God's service until the very end.
You give the impression of a humble man. Now, of course, all popes are humble before God, but not all popes perhaps conduct themselves in the way in which he did. Just tell me a little bit more about this life of service and where it started.
I think it probably started right where he was born. He was born in Buenos Aires, and that's where, his career in the clergy started. And, Buenos Aires is, first of all, a country, Argentina, that's had its share of political difficulties internally. And Buenos Aires can be an incredibly poor city. And I think throughout his papacy, it was very much about helping the weakest, the poor, the sick, the disenfranchised. And I think that's what he always did. There's this one story that I always remember, because I also covered when he was was elected to the papacy. And there's this one story that a friend of mine who lives in Rome told me, was that all the senior members of the clergy, when he became pope, were always scared of inviting him to dinner because they feared that if he came over for dinner and he might see the opulence in which they lived, he would advise them to live perhaps in a more, less opulent way, in a more simple way. But he lived that way himself. He didn't live in the usual papal apartments. He lived somewhere a lot more humble, and he very much lived along with other members of the clergy. So I think that's what people did see in him. There was an authenticity there. He lived what he preached.
Tell me a little bit more about the transition, something that had not happened in centuries between Benedict and himself. To what extent was his papacy defined by that transition, the way in which it happened, and the fact that a large chunk of what he did as Pope was with his predecessor living round the corner?
I know, and I mean, talk about shocks. That was a real shock when Pope Benedict stood down. And interestingly, it was during a press conference. And press conferences in the Vatican are usually in Latin. And most reporters maybe are not as strong in Latin as they should be, so they wait for the translation later. But there was one female Italian journalist who actually got the exclusive because she understood the Latin when Pope Benedict resigned. So it was a real shock. Interestingly, I don't think it made that much of an impact, if not a positive one. I do think they're very different popes. I think they're very different people. Benedict was a lot more shy, is the word that people would use about him, and Pope Francis was anything but. And so you could have thought, well, there might be a conflict there, but I don't think there was. And I think in the years when Benedict was still alive, I don't think you ever got the sense that Pope Francis wasn't the Pope. I think what I heard from some contacts in Rome is that actually Benedict would give him sound advice, and that he would very much rely on Benedict's, just opinions and views, but still be very much his own Pope. So that was a potential tense situation. And then in the end, I don't think detracted from his papacy.
So often when we talk about the Catholic Church, we talk about it in terms of the tension, perhaps not the right word, or the relationship between the more traditional wing of the Church and the modernizing wing of the Church. On that spectrum, where would you put him?
You see, that's so interesting because you say we talk. I mean, we in Europe, and especially Northern Europe, talk along those lines. And so it's very, words like progressive and traditional obviously mean different things depending on where you are. So let's start, with subjects like, it would be the involvement of women, it would be LGBTQ rights, abortion. I think in many ways what he did was that he changed the language, if not the doctrine. So on certain things, the Pope, on issues like abortion, you're not going to see a change there. But on issues like LGBTQ rights, I think you have seen a change in language. So famously, he was asked once about LGBTQ rights in gay communities, and he said, well, who am I to judge? If someone wants to honor God, who am I to judge whether they can or not? And he did try to make some moves towards, he's never, I don't think, in our lifetime, we're going to see a Pope bless gay marriage as such, but gay unions was different. And certainly his whole language was more accepting of gay people being able to rejoin the church and take part in mass as well. So I don't think we saw a lot of changes in the actual doctrine, but there was definitely a softening of the language and just a papacy that was more accepting.
For those of us who are not Catholics, what is often surprising at times like this, and indeed during the lifetime of a pope, is the way in which there is internal criticism, or at least conversation around the way in which they behave. And when it came to Francis, and correct me if I'm wrong here, it felt at times that he was being criticised from both ends, from the more progressive end of the church and also from the traditional end of the church. Is that fair?
I think it absolutely is fair. It's one of the difficulties, I think, of being a pope. I think when he was elected to the papacy, to the cardinals afterwards, he said, may God forgive you for your choice. I think he always realized that it was going to be a difficult one. Remember that the Catholic Church is huge. I mean, the word Catholic means universal. And so, for example, we were just having a discussion now about gay rights. Well, remember that in some hugely or overwhelmingly Catholic countries, in Africa, for example, homosexuality is illegal. And so it is very difficult to be the leader of one church that covers about 1.4 billion people, literally around the world, and be all things to all people. And I think there is always that balance that he had to strike.
I suppose to describe Francis as political would be to ignore the fact that to become Pope, you have to be political. But you mentioned he did meet J.D. Vance recently, Vice President of the United States, a man with certain views when it comes to migration, migrants, which of course Francis was. I mean, migration and migrants, that was a subject that he returned to time and time again over the course of his papacy.
I mean, he wasn't shy, was he? It cannot be a non-political role. Certainly, I guess if you do it properly. He spoke out about the war in Gaza very often. He spoke about lots of other conflicts around the world, many of which don't really make the headlines. But he certainly spoke about this issue of migration and became quite an uncomfortable figure for a lot of politicians, I guess especially on the right. And I say this because the right tends to be, at least in the West, a bit more linked to Christianity and religion as a whole. And I think in general, often politicians weaponize religion. And so you had this figure of the Pope that very much interprets the teachings of Jesus as in, when you help your brother, he doesn't mean literally your brother, not literally your countryman, not literally the people around you, but anyone who is in need. And to him, of course, those people also included migrants. And so, I mean, it was interesting. He did get to meet J.D. Vance very briefly yesterday. Perhaps ironic, I have to say, that was his last official meeting, I guess, because they have been at loggerheads, or at least, in a sort of subtle way. But even in the first Trump administration, comments were made by both Trump and, a bit more obliquely by the Pope about policies around what it means to be Christian. And it was very, very clear that acceptance and welcoming your brother and sister in need was one of the key parts of being Christian.
Any discussion, though, Barbara, of the Catholic Church, of the papacy, of Pope Francis, has to at some point talk about the child abuse that took place within the Church at the hands of Catholic priests. On reflection, do you think Francis did do enough to right the wrongs of the past?
I would say that it would be almost impossible to do enough to get rid of that, what you could see as an indelible stain. And I have to say, one that Catholics feel very keenly. Any Catholic mom who sends her child to, I don't know, like an away day or catechism will always think about that as well. So I would say that he tried. I think he met a lot of victims. I think he certainly tried to impose, and he did change some laws about safeguarding, but I think that he fell short. I think there was a case in Chile where perhaps he was too trusting and believed the story of one of the heads of the clergy there that said, he'd been innocent, and then it turned out that he wasn't. So I think the jury's out on that one. I do think his heart was in the right place, but it is something that will haunt the future Pope as well, whoever he will be, because it is such an issue.
But in your mind right now, what will he be remembered for?
I think what he'll be remembered for is that he lived up to his legacy of being Pope Francis. He was the Pope of the weakest. We've spoken so much now about a lot of the issues like women in the church or LGBTQ rights and all those cultural issues. It's not that he didn't address those, but I think he always tried to get it back to the main point, what he saw as the main tenet of Christianity, to help the poor, to help the less lucky than you. And I think that that's what he will be remembered for. And again, at a time when you see so much weaponization of religion, I think he just got it back down to the core. What does it mean to be Christian, to have a Christian morality? And to him, it was helping your fellow man and woman. It may sound silly to say about a pope, but I think he was a good man who lived his papacy in an authentic way.
Remind us, Barbara, you're off to the Vatican very, very shortly. What happens now in terms of the Catholic Church? Who is running the Catholic Church right now?
Now, they do have a system in place, and that's why it's so important that he does die in the Vatican, which he did. So everything is in place because it has to be quite a very structured handover of power. So we're going to see the funeral in a couple of days, and that is to give people from around the world the chance to come and see the burial of the Pope, which is going to be a much more simple funeral than usual. Not by our standards of simple, but by a papal standard of simple. And then we're going to see the conclave. Has to be said, another reason why the timing of his death is forgive the word, but, sort of good in the scheme of things, is because the cardinals are like the princes of the church. I think in the conclave, any cardinal that's under the age of 80 can come back to Rome and vote, but they literally come from all over the world because they are the representatives of the Catholic Church around the world. Had it happened before Easter, it would have been a complication because you don't want to pull them away during the Easter weeks. Remember that for Catholics, actually, Easter is the holiest day, not Christmas. So they'll all be making their way over, and then you're going to have to see the conclave. And this conclave will be very, very interesting. They're always, I don't know because nobody knows, but there's always a political element to them. There are factions because I think the biggest group of cardinals is the Italian. The second biggest group of cardinals by numbers are from the United States. And, we are seeing different interpretations of Catholicism, which is interesting because Catholicism is hierarchical with the Pope at the top. So you'd think that's the one religion where you shouldn't have differences because what the Pope says goes. But we are seeing them, this is happening at a time of huge political change when it comes to Western alliances, when it comes to society and culture, all sorts of things, and between religions as well. So it's going to be a fascinating conclave. And I think, the Pope is obviously a religious figure. If you're not Catholic, you could say, well, what do I care? It's just soft power. It doesn't impact me. But it is the next Pope will be a leading voice at a time when we are seeing huge change in international politics. So, but we should find out, it's between 15 and 20 days that there's the conclave. So in less than a month from now, we'll know who the next Pope is and who the successor of Pope Francis is.
And that's your lot for this edition of The Daily. Of course, much more on the death of the Pope is available on the website, skynews.com. We're back again tomorrow.